most controversial opinion out of the way right at the start. I love Baldur's Gate 3. I wouldn't spend this much time talking about it if I wasn't obsessed with it. But I think making Halsin a companion was a mistake. Yeah, that's right, and you know what? I think he should have been replaced by Kagha. Look, I know, I can hear the outrage coming through the screen, but just hear me out. The Oak Father demands it. Halsin was never supposed to be a companion, but thanks to his popularity with early access players, the developers at Larian decided to flesh out his story a little more and turn him into a recruitable character in the second act. Out of every addition and change made to Baldur's Gate 3 during the early access stage of development, it's my belief that this is probably the second worst choice the devs made. And if you want to hear what I think the first worst choice was, then you can go ahead and watch my early access Will video. Don't get me wrong, I like Halsin.
I like ducks.
I like having him around. I like his calm, nature daddy energy. I do wish that his character design leaned a little more into that bear idea, but that's besides the point. I'll explain myself more thoroughly later, but for now just know that the development attention paid to Halsin may have allegedly meant the removal of an entirely different companion. Allegedly, but I also think that he just makes Act 2 significantly weaker, and I'll tell you about why I think that way in just a bit. Alright, now that I've presumably made an enemy of half the people and adorable woodland creatures watching this video, for some reason, let's get into why I think Kagha would have been a better companion, and how I think her presence might have significantly strengthened the game's narrative. In order to make my case as compelling as possible, I'm going to be talking about the early access version of the game, diving deep into some druidic lore and easily missed details, and doing some reimagining of the first two acts of the game. We might even get a little tinfoil hatty in places where I think the developers meant to take the story, but backed out at the last minute, so this is gonna be a fun one. But prepare for some major spoilers of Acts 1 and 2, and maybe some more minor ones for Act 3, okay? Okay, Part 1. Kagha chameleon. When I first came across Kagha in early access, I was more than a little excited. For obvious reasons, I'm a pretty big fan of redheaded femmes in video games, and Claire Corbett does the voice of Kagha, and she gives the character such a haughty and decisive tone. She really feels like an intimidating and hateable presence right from the jump. And she's an elf, and she has a 6-snake companion. From a purely aesthetic point of view, I was already fixated on her, and then I got to know her, and I just fell for her immediately. If you've watched literally any of my other videos, then you know that I love dubious morals, redemption arcs, and I can fix them energy, and Kagha ticked all of those boxes, so not only was I into her design, but I was into her personality. Both in early access and the full release of the game, our first impression of Kagha is that she's a horrible, refugee-hating, child-endangering monster who's desperately trying to suck up all the air from the power vacuum left by Halsin's imprisonment. Without the true first druid around, she's managed to take over the grove and put in motion the Rite of Thorns, a ritual that, once completed, will seal the grove away forever, trapping all the druids inside and forcing all the tieflings out. So Kagha is a pretty stock standard antagonist. Even if you're playing an evil playthrough, the Rite of Thorns is a problem, since it prevents Minthara and her goblin army from advancing on the grove and slaughtering its inhabitants in the name of the Absolute. In that way, no matter how you play, Kagha ends up being just another barrier that we have to push past, but in reality, there's actually a lot going on with her character. And if you spend a little time exploring the Putrid Bog, or sneaking around the servants' quarters in the Druid's Grove, you find that out pretty quickly. Through letters left in a secret tree compartment or locked away in her personal chest, we learn that Kagha is secretly a burgeoning member of the Shadow Druids. The Shadow Druids are pretty ill-defined in Baldur's Gate 3, though they have been present in the series since the very first game. We aren't really told what their deal is here, but we are vaguely informed that they're evil by way of them taking the form of rats and wearing darker colored garb than our main druids. Plus, they're called the Shadow Druids, and that just sounds kind of creepy. In the lore, the Shadow Druids are pretty interesting. They're a dark druidic cult that operates out of Cloakwood Forest. They take a hardline stance against the development of civilization and actively try to beat back the progress of industry. They go to extreme, violent lengths to ensure that nothing encroaches on nature and even dabble in a little light extortion from time to time. And I mean, who doesn't? Kagha was seduced to the shadowy side through her deep yet misguided desire to protect her people from the horrors of the outside world. And, I believe, through a terrible fear of being alone. Kagha wants to close off the grove to keep her people safe, but more specifically, she wants to keep her people safe with her. She tells us that the viper must protect her brood, evoking images of a snake coiled possessively around a clutch of eggs. I don't think those actions stem from a true yearning for power and leadership. I think that Kagha just stumbled into power because it's the most efficient path to ensuring that her people stay exactly where they are, so they don't get hurt, and so that she doesn't end up by herself. You can see it in the way that she interacts with Olodin. Kagha bows to her easily. She's not really interested in being the top dog, or snake, or rat, or whatever. She correctly identifies that Faerun is growing more and more dangerous by the day. Hordes of goblins are throwing themselves at their gate, mind flayer tadpoles are wriggling out of corpses, an army is amassing nearby, and a group of tieflings were attacked on the road and are now seeking shelter in the grove. These are all threats to her druid circle from her perspective. And without a circle, she's practically nothing, at least in her eyes. She's a livestock guardian without any livestock to guard, so of course she's going to take drastic measures to make sure that everyone stays nestled safely and securely together. As Kagha tells us, the Shadow Druids taught her to perform the Rite of Thorns in order to keep her people safe. In return, she would hand the grove over to the cult, and then she would officially become First Druid. Easy peasy, job done. Except that would mean isolating a group of people from the lands that they should be helping, tossing a bunch of needy refugees out on their asses, and succumbing to the ideologies of an extremist cult, so let's not do that. After discovering evidence of Kagha's Shadow Druid affiliations, the player can return to the grove to confront her. Doing so forces the hidden Shadow Druids to show themselves, and a battle ensues. But interestingly and importantly, we are given the option to persuade Kagha out of her allegiance before the fight begins. If you're successful, she fights alongside you rather than against you, helps to defeat the Shadow Druids, and abandons her quest to complete the Rite of Thorns. It's a neat and tidy little plot, but when I played it in early access, I genuinely thought that it was a placeholder mission, similar to how we interacted with Karlach. For those that don't know, Karlach as we know her wasn't implemented in the earliest early access builds. Before the bigger body types were added, she looked like a totally different person. She pointed a crossbow at you, and she didn't ask to join you to destroy the Paladins of Tyr. Instead, she sent you off to deal with them yourself, and when you got back to her, she thanked you and suggested that you meet up with her in Baldur's Gate for a drink. Since we knew that Karlach was going to be a companion, it was assumed that this wasn't how it was going to play out in the full release, and obviously a lot has changed since those early days. But back in 2021, I was under the impression that Kagha's story was running along a similar vein. That in the full release, her story would be changed around a little. She would ask to join us on our adventures, and we'd be on our merry little way together. I figured she'd be one of my favorite companions, and then I learned that I am a fool. Upon further investigation into the subreddits, fan forums, and developer updates, I discovered that Larian had no intention of adding Kagha as a companion, and I was genuinely shocked by this. I really felt like they were setting her up for recruitment, but also I just saw so much potential in her. Obviously, Baldur's Gate 3 ended up being one of my favorite games of all time, so a lack of Kagha didn't totally ruin my experience. On release, as I jauntily journeyed through Act 1, I quickly forgot any feelings of disappointment. But then, Act 2 rolled around, and the critic in my brain would not shut up. While I adore the design of the Shadow-Cursed lands, and enjoy a lot of the unique mechanics and story beats to be found there, I couldn't help but feel that the overall plot was a little muddy. More specifically, Halsin's role felt tangential at best, unnecessary at worst, and all around just a little confusing. I started doing the thing I always do, which is imagining alternatives to how this story could have gone, and my feeble little mind went straight back to Kagha. If she had been the druid in our camp instead of Halsin, then things might have been different. They might have even been better. Ever since my first full release playthrough back in 2023, I've been crafting a expanded version of Kagha's story in my head, and that's kind of spiraled into a larger reimagining of the first two acts of the game. So now I'm inflicting my obsession onto all of you. So let me break down how I would change Kagha's story, and how I think that changing her story would change the game for the better. Part 2, Act 1. This is gonna get confusing. I don't have many issues with the way that Kagha's story stands in the full release of the game, but The one thing that I get hung up on is the confrontation scene. With just 2 successful rolls of the dice, you can sway this woman out of her firmly held beliefs hard enough for her to literally murder the woman she was groveling to a couple of seconds ago. It's actually part of why I thought that Kagha was going to be a companion, because I figured there was no way that this is how it was going to play out in the finished story. It just happens too quickly. A more satisfying conclusion to Kagha's breakup with the Shadow Druids ought to happen over a longer time span, but obviously we don't get that time because she's stuck in the first act of the game. So, assuming we're spending more time with her, what would that actually look like? Well, first of all, the confrontation scene needs to be reworked. In my reimagining, once the Shadow Druids show themselves, things wouldn't immediately devolve into a fight. Rather, their leader, Mistress Olodin, would say her piece about being discontented with the management of the Grove, warn the other druids that there's no winning against the forces of the Absolute, and then express disappointment in Kagha's performance as an agent of their organization. Then Olodin and the other Shadow Druids would turn back into rats and flee the scene, abandoning Kagha. I'm imagining that Kagha would be more distressed in this moment than she appears to be in the finished game. She would be dumbstruck at the reveal of her secret, penitent at Olodin's feet for not being a better agent, betrayed by their abandonment, and afraid for whatever comes next. And that is where our persuasion check comes in. We'd tell Kagha that she doesn't have to give herself over to the Shadow Druids, and that there's still hope for the Grove without the Right of Thorns, or any similar statement that can be used during the scene as it is in the full release. But even if the player manages to persuade Kagha, she shouldn't totally be swayed by them. On a successful check, she should just hesitate long enough for Wrath, the other druids, and Tav's party to start closing in on her. She'd babble apologetically while still trying to justify her actions. Wrath would order her to be imprisoned, mirroring the earlier scene from the full release with Arabella, and Kagha would totally freak out. Like the Shadow Druids before her, she would turn into some kind of small animal and hurry away, with Tilo the Snake slithering not far behind. If the player fails the check or doesn't even bother trying to persuade Kagha, then she would run off after the Shadow Druids without hesitation. And I know that those 2 endings sound like they're basically the same, but hopefully it would make a difference in how the player sees Kagha's character. It would be a little glimpse into the idea that she is ultimately capable of change. Watching her be so coldly abandoned by the Shadow Druids would maybe make some people feel a little sorry for her, and her frantic apologies would just reinforce that. Plus, we wouldn't know it at the time, but a successful check made here would make a check later in her story a lot easier, but be patient with me. Of course, the confrontation scene isn't Kagha's only path. Depending on how you play in the first act of the game, you might not find out that she's allied with the Shadow Druids at all, or you might kill her, either during the confrontation scene, or at Zevlor's order, or during the raid on the Grove with Minthara and the goblins.
What did you...
In my reimagining, if you never find out about Kagha, or you never bother confronting her before saving Halsin, then he would ream her out the same way he does in the full release for her attempted completion of the Right of Thorns. But instead of just stripping Kagha of her rank and allowing her to stay, Halsin would exile her from the Grove. He would tell her that she still has a lot to learn from the laws of nature, and to go out and commune with it. Meditate, and come to know peace and harmony. Kagha would spout some kind of ominous line about how there will never be harmony until the world bows to nature as its master, and then she'd leave. While you wouldn't get the option to kill Kagha during my reimagined version of the confrontation scene, you would be able to if you decided to raid the Grove, as long as you didn't confront her beforehand. I would love for Kagha to be treated more like one of the optional bosses in Act 2, because I adore how Larian approaches those potential fights, and I think it makes sense to extend that mechanic back into the first act. What I mean by that is once you've hack and slashed your way through the Grove and made your way into the Inner Sanctum, then Kagha and some of the other druids would be waiting for you, and it would initiate a cutscene. Let me reiterate that this would not be a complicated scene. I'm trying to make this reimagining as realistic as possible, so all I'm picturing is Kagha and the rest of the druids standing with their weapons drawn, ready to attack. She would admonish the player for betraying the Grove and allude to there being greater, more powerful forces waiting in the shadows to take revenge. The player could either move to attack, or, similar to Yrgir and the Thorm Triad, try to talk their way out of it. You'd essentially be threatening or convincing Kagha and the rest of the druids that if they value their lives, they need to stand down. Succeeding would mean that Kagha would turn into an animal and flee the scene, while the rest of the druids would concede defeat. And finally, if you allowed the Rite of Thorns to be completed, then you'd be out of luck, and her content would be behind a literal impenetrable wall. Basically as if you'd killed her. After the party at the end of Act 1, if Halsin is around, he'd steer you in the direction of the Shadow-Cursed lands, but he wouldn't ask to come with you. In my reimagining, he has no connection to the area, so he would return to the Grove and resume his position as First Druid. In the full release, I honestly don't love that everyone is clamoring for Halsin to get back and talking about how wonderful and necessary he is for the health of the Grove, and then he just skips town. I understand that there are hints at themes of responsibility in his story that he's meant to contend with, but handing off his home to an unseen, off-screen extra just feels like a weird move to me. But okay, back to Kagha. With what I've explained so far, we have 3 distinct pathways, right? Either Kagha leaves while remaining totally loyal to the Shadow Druids, or she leaves while sort of doubting the Shadow Druids, or you're shut out of her story entirely, either by killing her or sealing her up in the Grove. Now, where do we go from here? Part 3, Act 2. In my reimagining, when entering into the Shadow-Cursed lands, we would stumble upon Kagha, as long as she's not dead or hiding behind a wall of thorns. We'd spot her from a distance, taking in her surroundings and maybe investigating a gnarled branch or cursed animal carcass. But she'd be visibly shaken and clearly out of her depth. When we approach, she'd either greet us in a timid or hostile tone, depending on whether or not we successfully persuaded her in Act 1. And asking what she's doing there would result in one of 3 responses. If you confronted her about being a Shadow Druid, she would tell the player that thanks to them, she has no purpose. Without the support of a Druid circle, she had no idea what to do or where to go, so she followed the Shadow Druid's trail here, intending to apologize. And since then, she's found the Shadow Curse pretty much impassable on her own. If you didn't confront her, then she wouldn't mention the Shadow Druids by name. She'd say that since she failed in her goal to complete the Rite of Thorns and was pushed out by Halsin, she came to the Shadow-Cursed lands looking for a new Druid circle, but the land has proved difficult to navigate. And if you slaughtered the Grove, she'd say largely the same thing about searching for a new circle, but she'd have some half-sorrowful, half-cold-hearted line about her people being weak, and that their bodies will be more useful to the soil, as is the natural way of things. And she'd begrudgingly thank you for sparing her life. Either way, Kagha would openly discuss the death and decay that's poisoning the land, and it would be clear that she's conflicted about it. She'd mourn the loss of light and life, though she clearly admires the completely encompassing control of the curse. And she'd reference it as though she's somewhat familiar with the magic, which would indicate to the player that she might be harboring some valuable information about it. But still, she'd confess that the Shadow-Cursed lands have proven to be too much for her. She's alone, and she can't take it. The player could then suggest that she join up with them, since they could use more allies. Kagha would accept, and Kagha joins the party. And so does her little snake companion, Tila, who I imagine would hang out, show up in a few camp cutscenes, and maybe act as a summonable pet in battle. That last bit might be getting a little too far out of the scope of my fake imagined project here, so don't quote me on it. We're mostly focused on Kagha herself here, and one of the first opportunities we'd get to see another glimmer of her potential is at Last Light Inn. Taking Kagha to Last Light, or just talking to her after you visited the place, would be a major revelation for her character. A literal step into the light. It would essentially serve as a reflection of her story in Act 1, where suddenly Kagha is the burdened traveler in need of a soft place to land after a dangerous journey. There would be many an awkward conversation to be had with the likes of Alfira and the Tiefling kids, and Kagha would be forced to see their situation with fresh eyes as they relay new horrors to us about ambushes and kidnappings. Of course, this wouldn't immediately turn her into a good person, but I imagine that she'd have some kind of a line where she stiffly acknowledges that she's glad the Tieflings made it here, and that Jaheira was more welcoming than Kagha was back at the Grove. After the group experiences the effects of the Moon Lantern for the first time, Kagha would prompt the player to speak with her. She'd reiterate what we already know, which is that while the lantern might protect us from the worst of the curse's effects, it's only useful as long as you remain in its light. She'd insist that she knows a more permanent solution, and she'd mark a location on our map, that of the ruined house next to the shadowed battlefield. I know some of you are probably screaming at me right now that the Pixie's Blessing is already a more permanent solution, but in my reimagining, freeing Dolly from the Moon Lantern wouldn't grant you any kind of benefit. She would just fly off. This always made more sense to me from a behavioral standpoint because we were told that pixies specifically are mischievous creatures. Plus, it would be a solid lesson about how not every good deed goes unpunished or straightforwardly rewarded. And it would make Kagha's plot more important on a gameplay level since we'd be severely encouraged to go to the ruined house. And when we do go to the house, we would not find a creepy little ghost boy demanding to be played with. Part 4. Surprise Tangent. I've been holding this in long enough now. I think it's finally time for me to admit how much I hate the Spirit of the Forest, Oliver and Thaniel split personality, sleepy art culling subplot that revolves around Halsin and the full released version of Act 2. Maybe I'm the idiot, but the story never feels all that well explained. Halsin has known about the Shadow Curse for years and feels responsible for it because he was there when Ketheric first fell, and the rest of the giant army didn't kill him well enough, I guess. And he has a special boyhood connection with the literal spirit of the forest. I don't know, it all feels a little convoluted and disconnected in my opinion. Allegedly, some data miners discovered that at some point in development, Larian had written it so that Halsin had a much more explicit role in the creation of the Shadow Curse. There used to exist a journal written by Halsin wherein he admits to being the one who killed Isabel after negotiations with Ketheric went awry, and her death sparked Ketheric's supervillain arc, which thusly produced the Shadow Curse. Halsin said he thrust his glaive into Isabel's chest and later named that glaive Sorrow because he was so torn up about it. And yes, that weapon still exists in-game, and yes, that scrapped content is probably why its description is so sad for seemingly no reason, why our characters remark that touching it makes them feel like there's a pit in their stomach, and why it's given such a place of prominence in the Druid's Grove. But unfortunately, that bit of Halsin's story didn't make it into the full release, so we instead get this kind of flaccid idea that he was just there. Additionally, the characters of Art, Thaniel, and Oliver are never properly realized. The idea that Thaniel and Oliver are simultaneously the same person and also two different people is a little awkwardly conveyed. And the way Thaniel hangs out at camp and creepily stares off into space while spouting off vaguely prophetic sounding phrases feels out of step with the tone of the rest of the game. Like, we've already got one unknowable supernatural being in camp, and he is way funnier than you, Thaniel. Art appears to be a pretty pitiable figure whose ultimate fate is to wither away and die, but we don't really get enough of him to care all that much, which is so mean, but it's true. These people are more like plot devices, and since Halsin's motivations are so muddled on top of that, the whole story just falls totally flat. This is extra disappointing since it detracts from the impact of the main plot of Act 2. Because of how strange and undefined the Thaniel plot is, the connection between it and Ketheric's hold on the land feels vague and thin and only obscures the finer details of the story. And moreover, shunting Halsin into the broader story may have contributed to the removal of Helia, a bard companion that was cut during development. I should provide the context that while Helia definitely existed, it isn't at all confirmed that Halsin is the reason she was cut from the game. And we don't know for sure how involved Halsin would have been if early access players didn't demand for him to be a more prominent feature because of how much they loved him. However, something took away from Helia's development time, and it very well could have been Halsin. Helia was either a halfling or a gnome, and she was going to be a werewolf. Data miners found her character model, as well as over 700 voice lines from her buried in the game. There are even voice lines from our other companions that acknowledge her existence.
What I see is my business. Tell the were-gnome about your wet dreams. I'm staying out of it. What I see is my business. Tell the halfling about your wet dreams. I'm staying out of it.
Okay, and on you go. Set. Can you even see that? Okay. This is what we're doing. This is my life now. If I can don my tinfoil hat for a moment, I assume the werewolves we find in Cazador's palace are probably holdovers from this scrapped character's plot. And there might even be some cool connective tissue there with Shadowheart's story as well, which had the potential to be really cool, but we got Halsin instead, allegedly. Allegedly, even if he wasn't directly responsible for Larian cutting Helia, it's undeniable that the development effort required to turn Halsin into a companion could have been better spent elsewhere to greater effect. I just think it's unfortunate that this is yet another example of Larian bowing to the whims of early access players rather than forging ahead with what's actually best for the structure of their game. Like we discussed in my early access will video, there's a difference between having a good relationship with your player base and allowing them to railroad production. But I digress. In my reimagining, there would be no Art Cullig, no Thaniel, and no Oliver. Even though, fun fact, both Thaniel and Oliver are also voiced by Kagha's voice actress Claire Corbett, which I just think is really cool. It's a bit of behind-the-scenes trivia that I know none of you are going to care about, but I got unreasonably excited over. So back to Kagha's reimagined story. She told us she has a more permanent solution, so we don't have to rely on the moon lantern, and we are headed to the ruined house. Part 5. Act 2, part 2. It's a giant spider on the wall. I'm gonna ignore him. This is a video about druids. He's allowed to live. In place of Oliver, we would find a rat at the ruined house. And that rat would transform into Pinta, one of the other shadow druids that accompanied Olodin at the grove. Assuming you brought Kagha to the meeting, Pinta would have some kind of snide remark about her crawling back to Olodin. Kagha would assure her that she's not trying to waste anybody's time, and she would plead with her to open a portal. Pinta would spend a little more time calling Kagha pathetic, but she would ultimately do as she was asked and open a portal to the Shadowfell. Now again, I am trying to be as realistic as possible with this reimagining of Kagha, and comparing how much content she would conceivably have if we swapped her out with Halsin. So I realize that what I'm about to pitch is probably the biggest ask of this entire video, but I want to go to the Shadowfell. In the full release, Halsin's portal fight, which I do like mechanically, is still kind of a letdown. Because we had an opportunity to see another area of the Shadowfell outside of the Nightsong's prison, but instead we get to stand outside the portal and wait around for Halsin to bust back out. It was such a tease, and I earnestly believe that there was some version of this script that allowed us to go in there and help Halsin retrieve Thaniel. So in my reimagining, we would get to go to the Shadowfell, and I'm not expecting a giant map. I'd be happy with something the size of the dinosaur jungle the Jinn transports us to at the circus in Act 3. Or even something smaller, just a bite-sized bit of terrain. Populating this tiny map would be a surreal dead forest, and among the hollow trees, Olodin and her small troop of shadow druids would have made themselves a sort of home. Perched atop a stump as if it were a royal throne, Olodin would greet us in a voice that just oozes disdain and sarcasm. She would call Kagha weak and incapable for failing to enact the right of thrones at the Grove, and she would ask us what we're doing there. Kagha would respond with a mix of reverence and fear, similar— the spider's getting closer. Oh no! Buddy, I said you'd live, but don't bother me. Kagha would respond with a mix of reverence and fear, similar to the tone that we hear her use in the full release.
Mistress Olodin, I can explain.
During this conversation, we would reconfirm that Kagha was just trying to get to the Shadow Druids this whole time, but she couldn't traverse the Shadow Curse lands by herself. She needed the player's help to get her there. Depending on whether your character knew about the Shadow Druids or not, this would either come off as a twist reveal or just a neutral statement of information. We'd also find out that the Shadow Druids have been permitted to dwell in the Shadowfell specifically because this particular sect is helping Ketheric maintain the Shadow Curse on the land. For this reason, they possess an ability that allows them to penetrate the most potently polluted areas without injury. A Shadow's blessing, if you will. Kagha would throw herself at Olodin's feet and ask for another chance to join the Shadow Druids. Her logic here would basically be that everybody gets what they want. Kagha would be let back into a circle, which she desperately craves, and once she's finally an official Shadow Druid, she or one of the others would bestow the Shadow's blessing on the player, which would make their journey significantly easier. But Olodin isn't about to let Kagha just waltz in here, slap her name on the sign-up sheet, and join the club. She's already failed the Shadow Druids once before, so if she wants another chance to redeem herself, then she'll have to do something for them first. The Shadow Druids are planning on increasing the strength of the curse so that more of the land becomes impassable without their Shadow's blessing. But in order to do that, they have to perform a ritual that requires a powerful magical object of attunement, an Idol of Shar. It's essentially a more messed up version of the Rite of Thorns, which needed the Idol of Sylvanas. Olodin has sent some Shadow Druids to go and retrieve the idol, but they haven't returned, and she's beginning to think something happened to them. So if Kagha can come back with the Idol of Shar, then she'll make her a full member of the cult. And that would truly begin Kagha's personal quest. Oh, unsettling. I don't know where it went. Well, if I die while I'm recording this video, you know, a spider bit me. Now you might be thinking, Ash, the Shadow Druids might be evil, but they're still druids. Why would they partner with Ketheric to poison nature with necrotic energy? And my answer to that is twofold. First, the Shadow Druids are already prone to extreme, borderline terroristic acts to preserve what their idea of nature is and should be. And death and decay are just as much a part of nature as birth and life. It wouldn't take much convincing from a powerful man like Ketheric to sway the Shadow Druids into believing that this level of control over the land is a benefit to everyone. In a way, nature has taken over. It's just a cruel, twisted version of it. And second, Olodin would be infected with a tadpole, so there would be even less of a leap to make to convince her that this is the right move. Like Minthara and the countless other tadpoled leaders, Olodin would genuinely believe that she's doing the right thing, and her followers would fall in line behind her. What's wild is that there's already evidence of this plot in the full release of the game. In Moonrise Towers, there's a note on a desk that addresses the Druids as a faction. The Cult of the Absolute plans to try to force the Shadow Druids to remain neutral in the oncoming war, and eventually infect all the Circle leaders with tadpoles. So it's not like I'm pulling this out of thin air. The groundwork has already been laid, I'm just tweaking it a little. The presence of the Shadow Druids in the full release at all does point to the idea that perhaps they were more entwined with the full story at some point. It does strike me as odd that they just show up that one time in Act 1 and then are never important again. One of Baldur's Gate 3's concept artists, Dan Yorgulescu, posted his work on his personal website, and one of his pieces shows a selection of Shadow Druid armor which didn't make it into the official art book, but the layout resembles other prominent factions that did make it into the art book, so I'm just saying, it's all there. Obviously, good-aligned players would have some major reservations about working with the Shadow Druids, but they wouldn't have much choice if they wanted a better way to traverse the Shadow-cursed lands. And of course, there would be an option to turn this around and give Kagha a happy, not evil ending. Some optional dialogue between her and the player where they discuss the Shadow Druids would hint at that, but we can't really talk about that until we get a little further into her quest, so let's continue. Olodin would steer us in the direction of Wraithwyn, and specifically the House of Healing. There, we would meet Malice Thorm and his staff of Silent Hill-coded nurses. The poor soul they're operating on would be one of Olodin's agents, maybe Ren, and there would be other Shadow Druid corpses littered throughout the building as a bit of visual storytelling. The scene would play out the same way it does in the full release, but with an added line of dialogue that says we're just here for the Idol of Shar, but Malice doesn't care, he's way too far gone. We'd have all the same options we get in the full release to either kill Malice or convince him to do the job himself. But instead of dropping Art Cullig's battered loot, he would drop the Idol of Shar, and the thing would be practically pulsing with magical energy. Clearly, his fervent and horrific devotion to his goddess has earned her favor, and it's going to be a great ritualistic object of attunement. Assuming you have Kagha in your party for this moment, she would have something positive to say about finding the idol, but since this girl has never been good at hiding her emotions, it would also be blatantly obvious that she is horrified by the actions taken by Malice, and she recognizes that if she becomes a Shadow Druid, she would be complicit in this kind of monstrous behavior. And the player could gently nudge her in the direction that maybe the Shadow Druids aren't all that she's built them up to be in her head. And as a side note, it's really frustrating for me that in the full release, you can't have Halsin in your party for this moment. Forcing us to do 90% of Halsin's quest without being able to have him in the party makes him feel extremely disconnected from his own story, and it makes all his lines about having to do this himself and feeling personally responsible feel almost insulting.
It has to be me. And only me.
Like, okay buddy, I'm pretty sure it was me and only me that did most of the work while you milled about in camp, but go off, I guess. Having Kagha there to experience her story would be a massive improvement, and giving us even the smallest connection to the tortured man on the operating table would make that scene even more of a nightmare than it already is. But okay, we've retrieved the Idol of Shar. Now all that's left to do is return to Olodin. Heading through the portal and into the Shadowfell, the Shadow Druid's mistress would be genuinely surprised to see that Kagha made it back in one piece. When we inform Olodin of the terrible fate that befell the other druids, she would dismissively wave it off. What matters now is that they can begin the ritual. Kagha would ask what would happen if the druids weren't there to help maintain the curse, and Olodin would explain that the curse would weaken without their help, and they can't let that happen, so the ritual needs to take place. The player would get a dialogue option that essentially amounts to, "not on my watch," and the shadow druids would immediately become hostile. They would move to attack, and Olodin would command Kagha to fight alongside them, similarly to the way that she does in the full release of the game at the Grove. And this is where we would finally be able to fully persuade Kagha into siding with us over the shadow druids. In my opinion, this feels like a much more natural place for this persuasion check. Kagha will now know what it's like to be a lost traveler in need. She'll have experienced the ravages of the curse up close, she'll have seen how Olodin treats her people, and she'll have developed a real relationship with the player and the other companions. It would all make her decision to switch sides a lot more believable and less abrupt. And the check itself would be significantly easier if you passed the first one in Act 1. I'm thinking like a 10 or a 15 instead of an 18 or a 22, but I'm not good with numbers. I'm not that kind of a nerd. Successfully persuading Kagha would mean that she helps you in the fight against the Shadow Druids, but once they're dead, she would become distraught. After being pushed out of her home for trying to protect her people, Kagha thought that she could find solace in the embrace of the shadows, but here she is again, alone. Her worst fear, according to me. And in that moment, after she's killed the Shadow Druids, she would assume that she had just destroyed the last chance she had of assimilating into a group. She would be second-guessing herself, her judgment, and her very essence, but the player could offer her words of encouragement and remind her that she isn't alone as long as she remains with the party. And Kagha would find comfort in knowing that now that the Shadow Druids are dead, Kethric's grip on the land is just a little bit looser. There'd be a quick cutaway back to Wraithwyn, where the curse has been lessened, so it no longer requires the Moon Lantern to explore. I think this kind of tangible effect is necessary, and it's missing from the full release of the game. There's no visual or gameplay changes made to the map after we save Thaniel, and so that just kind of adds to the confusion about how important he really is to the overall story. You only see the effect he had if you don't save him and leave for Act 3, because then the curse is only half lifted. In my reimagining, assuming you're doing a good playthrough, Kagha would be able to look back and bask in the glow of her victory as life returns to the land. She and the player would know definitively what they've done to contribute to it, which would give her some level of assurance that perhaps she can trust her own judgment after all. But if you allow the ritual to proceed without incident, then it would do what Olodin said it would. The power of the Shadow Curse would strengthen, and more of the land would be swallowed up. Kagha would become a Shadow Druid and be fully on board with the Absolute Cult's evil plot, and the party would receive the Shadow's Blessing, which is, of course, the evil path. Like Halsin in the full release, Kagha's story would effectively end there, but we still have a few loose ends to tie up, including that little matter of Kagha being afraid to be alone. Part 6. Act 3. Heading into Rivington and Baldur's Gate proper would hit the final beats of Kagha's reimagined story arc. Similar to Halsin in the full release, it wouldn't be a whole involved quest line, but rather a few strayed dialogue lines that would cement her growth as a character. If you're on her good path and you have her in your party while you encounter refugees in Rivington, then she would have dialogue where she stands up for them, and she'd offer apologies to the tieflings found on the outskirts of the city. Once you get into Baldur's Gate, Kagha would have a line about how she sees merit in the city, that despite it being thrown into chaos, there are still people here who are trying to look after each other. This is the antithesis of a line that Halsin has in Act 3 where he says,
"Perhaps the Shadow Druids were right in their own twisted way. If such sorrows are the fruits of civilization, perhaps there can be no true balance between it and nature."
Which kind of comes out of nowhere and is honestly a pretty hopeless and uncharitable read of the situation, since the reason for all the unsavory business he mentions is directly caused by Gortash and the Absolute and not the city itself. And we see examples of the goodness of the human spirit all over the place intermixed with cruelty. It's a balance, as in nature, and I don't know, I don't love this line. But if you were on the evil path of my reimagined version of Kagha's plot, then she'd be spouting lines like this left and right. She'd hold nothing but contempt for the refugees and be absolutely disgusted by the city and all its ills. Outside of this, there wouldn't be a whole lot left for Kagha to do in Act 3, unless of course you romance her. Part 6.5. But can I still have sex with the bear? Yeah, you know what? Sure. Once you've completed Kagha's reimagined story in Act 2, you would absolutely have the option to romance her. And she is a druid, so why wouldn't she also turn into a bear? We are all goddamn degenerates, I swear. Since we have so little poly representation in this game, it would be cruel to take it away, so we can also say that Kagha would follow the druidic principles of free love. Not that it matters much, since we're able to form a healthy polyamorous relationship with so few characters in this game, but That's not what this video is about. Seriously though, you gave us all these incredible characters that are all player sexual, and the only one that's actually genuinely cool with an open relationship is Shadowheart. Anyway, I imagine a Kagha romance would initially be very tender and eventually evolve into something more passionate if you chose the good arc for her character. She'd be working on building her confidence back up, but once she did, I can imagine this woman knowing exactly what she wants and not being shy at all about telling you what that is. There would certainly be a current running through it where she would be searching for community and finding it in you, which I think would be pretty fulfilling. Kagha on her evil path would be much more commanding and possessive, so you'd be missing out on that tenderness, but make up for it by being in a relationship with a red-headed Dami mommy, if you're into that sort of thing. At the very end of the game, a romanced evil Kagha would offer that the two of you could shack up in a grove of your own, with her as first druid presiding over a new and particularly evil brood. And if you didn't romance her, then she would go off without you to do the same thing. A good aligned romanced Kagha, however, would have a much more bittersweet ending. Harkening back to the idea that Kagha's worst fear is to be alone, it only makes sense that she would overcome that fear by the end of her story. She would confide in a romanced player that their support has helped her develop true confidence, and she finally knows what has to come next for her. She has to strike out on her own. She would echo Halsin's earlier advice back in my reimagined version of Act 1 when he told her she still has a lot to learn from the laws of nature, and to go out and commune with it, meditate, and come to know peace and harmony. She would promise to return when she felt ready, and she would in fact show up to the party scene to reunite with the player at the very end. She'd tell us that after spending many long nights alone with nothing but her thoughts and abilities, she's learned to trust herself as surely as she trusts in nature. And now she's ready for a new adventure, with the player and maybe with their other partner if they'll have her. And if you didn't romance her, then good aligned Kagha would have a similar sentiment to share, just without any of the romantic overtones. Through your continued friendship, she felt supported, and now, at the end of it all, she's looking for a new adventure. The reason I went with this go-it-alone angle for Kagha is that while I do love how many of our companions learn to embrace the communal kindness of the group after being lonely, isolated, or cruelly controlled for so long, self-contentment is just as important. Kagha doesn't need to learn to lead a new group of druids with a softer hand or take up a new heroic cause. She just needs to learn to be comfortable in herself, and that's a much quieter and understated story than any of our other companions get, but I think that's a story worth telling, which is why I told it to you. Part 7. The End. I would like to take a moment to just really hammer home the fact that I sat here for upwards of 45 minutes talking to you about a frankly inconsequential C-tier NPC in a video game full of amazing characters. Part of the reason I did that is because I have an overactive imagination, obsessive tendencies, and I spend way too much time sitting in front of my computer. But this video was also made possible by the developers at Larian, who crafted a game that allowed for this level of creative speculation and play. I know I harped on Halsin and his Act 2 plot pretty harshly in this video, and I do stand by that. I stand by the points that I made, and I do think that my reimagining would have made for a tighter, better, and more impactful story than we got. But that doesn't mean I see absolutely nothing good about our resident himbo elf and his happy tree friend. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I like Halsin, and I love this game. That's why I make these videos. I am having the time of my life writing these little what-if stories, sharing them all with you, and then reading your thoughts in the comments. Which, if you've ever left even a single comment on one of my videos, I sincerely can't thank you enough. They really do make this whole thing worthwhile. They mean the world to me. I read every single one, and if you're subscribed to me, that's even better. You guys are really making this journey feel special and fun, and you're encouraging me to keep going, so thank you for that, and I guess I'll see you in the next one. Bye! I realize that there's an overrepresentation of druids in our party, and that making Kagha a companion doesn't really help with that, but my other hotter take is that we should not have gotten Jaheira and Minsk as companions, and we should have actually gotten Alfira the Bard instead. And you better believe I have a whole headcanon for her as well, but that's not the next video. We're not doing Alfira in the next video. I promised myself I'd do something not Baldur's Gate related, and goddammit, I like other games, you guys. I'm gonna do something not Baldur's Gate, I promise.